I woke up after surgery, and for 3 days, not a single one of my kids came to visit. When I finally made it back home, a wrapped gift box was already sitting on the porch with a note. "Hope you feel better, Dad. Don't be too surprised." I opened it. My hands began to shake, and I called 911. Just as my wife pulled into the driveway, the sheriff arrived at my house. The exact moment the officer opened that box, all the color drained from my wife's face. "Please, no, this can't be." "Thank you for tuning into Dad's Revenge Stories. I truly appreciate you being here. Where are you watching from today? Let me know your city or country in the comments section. Also, please note, this narrative contains fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the core message remains highly useful. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the ceiling. It was one of those suspended tile ceilings they put in hospital rooms, pale white, slightly yellowed near the edges, with a long fluorescent light that hummed just loud enough to be annoying. I had been staring at that same ceiling for 3 days. I knew every water stain on it by heart. The second thing I noticed was that the chair beside my bed was empty. It had been empty every time I opened my eyes. The nurses, who had been kinder to me than I deserved given how little patience I had shown in those first foggy hours after surgery, had placed a chair there on the first day. A simple padded chair with a blue vinyl cushion, the kind designed for family members to sit in while they waited. Nobody had sat in it. Not once. I was 60 years old. I had spent 35 of those years as a warehouse supervisor at Millhaven County School District, making sure textbooks and equipment and supplies moved from one place to another without getting lost, damaged, or stolen. I was not a man who asked for much, but lying in that hospital bed on the third morning, watching the light come through the window blinds, in long, pale strips, I found myself staring at that empty chair and feeling something I was not accustomed to feeling: foolish. I felt foolish. My son Raymond had not come. My daughter-in-law Chloe had not come. I had told myself on the first day that they were probably just giving me space. On the second day, I told myself Raymond was likely handling things at home, making sure the house was in order, maybe checking on his mother. By the third morning, I had run out of explanations, and I was too tired to manufacture new ones. Dr. Evelyn Thorne came in just after 7 in the morning. She was a small woman, 50-ish, with dark hair pulled back tight, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had the manner of someone who had delivered a great deal of difficult news over the years and had learned that efficiency was its own form of mercy. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," she said, picking up my chart from the hook at the foot of the bed. "How's the right hand feeling today?" I flexed my fingers. There was a slight tremor, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. The stroke had been mild, as strokes go, but the neurological effects on my right hand were going to take time. Dr. Thorne had explained it to me carefully on the first day: localized motor tremor, likely temporary, possibly permanent. The kind of thing that made certain physical tasks, like writing, for instance, considerably more difficult than they used to be. "Same as yesterday," I said. She nodded, made a note. "Your blood pressure is looking better. We're going to go ahead and process your discharge paperwork this morning." She glanced up from the chart and looked at the empty chair with the same expression the night nurses had been wearing for 2 days. "Is someone coming to pick you up?" "My son is on his way," I said. She looked at me for just a moment longer than necessary. Then she put her reading glasses on and went back to the chart. "I'll have the discharge papers ready within the hour." She was being kind. We both knew it. Raymond was not on his way. I had called him that morning. The phone had rung 4 times and gone to voicemail. I had left a message that I was being discharged and could use a ride. He had not called back. I called a taxi service instead. Yellow Cab, which still existed in Millhaven, even though half the town had moved to those rideshare apps my wife Martha kept trying to show me on her phone. The dispatcher told me 45 minutes. Signing the discharge papers was harder than it should have been. My right hand shook slightly as I held the pen, and I had to concentrate in a way I was not used to concentrating, just to make the letters legible. The admissions nurse, a young woman named Tama, who had been nothing but patient with me all week, watched without saying anything. I appreciated that more than I could express. "You take care of yourself, Mr. Calloway," she said when I handed the clipboard back. "I intend to," I said. The taxi driver was a heavy-set man named Gerald, who kept the radio on a country station and did not try to make conversation, which suited me perfectly. I sat in the back seat and watched Millhaven go by through the window. The lawns were green, the sky was enormous and blue, and people were moving through their ordinary days as if nothing had happened. Nothing had happened to them. Something had happened to me. My house on Clover Ridge Road looked the same as it always did, a single-story brick ranch with a covered porch and 2 old oak trees in the front yard that Martha had planted the year we moved in. I paid Gerald, thanked him, and walked up the driveway carrying the small bag the nurses had helped me pack. That was when I saw the box. It was sitting in the center of the porch, directly in front of the door. A rectangular box, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in red paper and tied with a gold ribbon, the kind of wrapping you might see on a Christmas present or a birthday gift. A small white envelope had been taped to the top. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at it for a long moment. I was not expecting a package. Martha was visiting her sister in Beaumont for the week, and I hadn't ordered anything online. I climbed the steps, slowly set my bag down, and picked up the envelope. The note inside was short. 5 words printed in block letters on a plain white card. "Hope you feel better, Dad. Don't be too surprised." My stomach dropped before I even opened the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of white tissue paper, was a savings account passbook, the old-fashioned paper kind that some banks still issued for long-term accounts. The account was registered under my name, Arthur James Calloway. The balance listed was just over $2 million. I had no such account. Beneath the passbook was a rubber stamp, a heavy official-looking stamp with a worn wooden handle. I recognized it immediately because I had held it in my hands hundreds of times over 35 years. It was the inventory authorization stamp from the Millhaven County School District warehouse. The stamp I had surrendered personally when I retired with a signed receipt, witnessed by my supervisor, and logged in the district records office. My hands started shaking. Not from the stroke. I set everything down on the porch railing very carefully, the way you set something down when you are afraid of what might happen if you drop it. Then I sat down on the top porch step, took my phone out of my jacket pocket, and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? My name is Arthur Calloway, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I need to report something. I'm not entirely sure what to call it yet, but I think someone is trying to make me look like a criminal. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I sat on that top step and waited. Looking out at the oak trees Martha had planted, listening to the sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. The summer morning continued being beautiful and ordinary around me. Inside that box on my porch, something that was meant to ruin my life sat wrapped in red paper with a gold ribbon. Sheriff Dale Miller arrived 11 minutes after I called. I know it was 11 minutes because I had been counting. Not deliberately, I am not the kind of man who times things out of anxiety, but because sitting on those porch steps with nothing to do except wait gave my mind nowhere else to go. I counted the seconds between the cars that passed on Clover Ridge Road. I counted the rings of the lawnmower engine down the block as it turned at the end of each row. By the time the sheriff's cruiser turned into my driveway, I had also counted the number of times a mockingbird in the left oak tree changed its song. 14. The bird changed its song 14 times. Sheriff Dale Miller was a big man, broad through the shoulders with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of permanent squint that came from spending too many Texas summers outdoors. He had been sheriff of Millhaven County for going on 18 years. I had met him exactly twice before, once at a school district safety meeting, and once at the 4th of July parade downtown, where he had handed my granddaughter Lily a small American flag from the back of a flatbed truck. He was not the sort of man who smiled easily, but he was not unfriendly. He climbed out of the cruiser and walked toward the porch with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who had learned long ago that rushing into a situation before you understood it was how mistakes got made. "Mr. Calloway," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sheriff?" I stood up slowly, my right hand gripping the porch railing for balance. "Thank you for coming quickly." He looked at the box on the porch railing where I had left it. He did not touch it. "Tell me what happened," I told him. I kept it factual the way I had been trained to keep things in 35 years of inventory work, dates, times, specific descriptions, no editorializing. I told him about the discharge from the hospital, the taxi ride home, the box on the porch, the note, the passbook, the stamp. I told him about the stamp specifically, that it was the official authorization stamp of the Millhaven County School District warehouse, that I had surrendered it personally upon retirement, that the surrender had been documented with a signed receipt witnessed by 2 people and filed with the district records office. Miller listened without interrupting. He had taken a small notebook from his breast pocket and was writing in it with a stub of pencil, but his eyes stayed on me most of the time, reading my face the way experienced lawmen read faces. "You haven't touched anything inside the box since you found it?" he asked when I finished. "I moved the passbook and the stamp to look underneath them. That's all." He nodded, made a note. "And the note you handled that?" I picked it up to read it. "Yes, okay." He looked at the box again. "We're going to need to treat this as potential evidence, Mr. Calloway. I'd like to photograph everything before we go any further. Are you all right with that?" "Sheriff," I said, "that is exactly what I was hoping you would say." He was reaching for his radio when we both heard it, the sound of a car turning into the driveway. I recognized the engine before I saw the vehicle. Martha drove a silver Buick Enclave that needed a new muffler, a fact I had been telling her about for 8 months, and that she had been cheerfully ignoring for the same amount of time. The sound of it was as familiar to me as her voice. She pulled in beside the sheriff's cruiser and sat there for a moment with the engine running. I could see her through the windshield, looking at the cruiser, looking at me, looking at the box on the railing. Then she turned the engine off. Martha Calloway was 58 years old, a retired elementary school teacher with silver hair. She wore short and practical, and a face that had always told the truth about what she was feeling, whether she intended it to or not. She was a woman who had cried openly at her students' graduations for 30 years, and who kept a box of tissues in every room of our house, and who had held my hand in that hospital without any fuss or drama. On the one occasion she had come to see me, which had been on the evening of the first day, for about 40 minutes, before she drove back to Beaumont to continue her visit. She climbed out of the Buick slowly. She walked toward the porch with her purse over one shoulder and her eyes fixed on the box. Sheriff Miller stepped slightly to the side to give her a clear view of the railing. The moment she saw the contents, the red-covered passbook, the heavy stamp with its worn wooden handle, her face did something I had never seen Martha Calloway's face do in 38 years of marriage. Every bit of color left it. Not gradually, the way color drains from a face when someone feels faint, but all at once as if someone had simply switched a light off behind her eyes. Her purse slipped off her shoulder and hit the porch floorboards with a heavy thud. She pressed both hands flat against her sternum fingers, splayed like someone trying to hold something inside their own chest. "Martha," I said. I started toward her. "Please." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Cracked and thin, the voice of a woman trying very hard not to fall apart in front of a stranger. "Please, no, this can't be." "Ma'am," Miller said carefully, "do you recognize these items?" Martha's eyes were filling fast. She looked at the stamp, then at me, then back at the stamp. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped so low I had to lean forward to hear her. "Raymond," she said. Just the one word. Just our son's name spoken the way you might speak the name of something you had always been afraid of and had finally terribly been proven right to fear. I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. Miller's radio crackled before any of us could speak again. He unclipped it from his shoulder, listened for several seconds, his expression giving away nothing. Then he looked at me with eyes that had shifted not unfriendly, but careful in a new way. "Mr. Calloway," he said slowly, 2 minutes after you called 911 this morning, my dispatch received a second call. Anonymous, reporting that a former school district employee named Arthur Calloway was, quote, attempting to move stolen funds after being released from the hospital. The morning air felt suddenly thinner. "Someone called that in," I said, "while I was sitting on these steps." "Yes, sir." Miller looked at the box, then at Martha, then back at me. "That's what makes this considerably more complicated than a prank. People ask me sometimes what it feels like to be betrayed by your own child. I never know how to answer that question, because the honest answer is that it does not feel like one thing. It feels like several things happening simultaneously. The way a car accident happens, there is the impact, and then there is the strange, suspended moment after the impact, where your brain is still trying to catch up to what your body already knows. Standing on that porch with Sheriff Miller's words still hanging in the summer air, I felt the impact. But the catching up that took considerably longer. Before I tell you about Raymond, I need to tell you who I was before Raymond existed. Not because I want your sympathy, but because a story only makes sense if you understand what was at stake. I grew up in Millhaven, Texas, the second of 3 sons, born to a man who drove a bread truck and a woman who kept the books for a hardware store on Main Street. We were not poor, but we were careful. My father used to say that a man's word and a man's records were the same thing. If either one didn't balance, you had a problem. I carried that belief into every job I ever held. I started working for the Millhaven County School District at 24 years old, hired as a junior inventory clerk for the central warehouse. The warehouse supplied every school in the county, textbooks, athletic equipment, science lab materials, custodial supplies, cafeteria goods, hundreds of thousands of items moving in and out every year. I tracked every single one of them. I was good at it. Not brilliant, not flashy good. The careful, reliable, show up every morning kind of good that doesn't get you written up in newspapers but builds something solid over time. By the time I was 30, I was running the receiving department. By 40, I was warehouse supervisor. I held that position for the last 20 years of my career, and in all that time, not one audit, not one came back with an unexplained discrepancy. I retired at 59 with a commendation letter from the school board and a watch that cost the district $40 and meant more to me than anything I owned. I met Martha in this town, married her in this town, and built a life here that I was genuinely proud of. We had 2 children. Our daughter Caroline came first, bright, stubborn, full of opinions about everything, the kind of person who made every room feel more alive. We lost Caroline 7 years ago to an illness that moved faster than any of us were prepared for. She left behind a daughter, Lily, who was 1 year old at the time, and the specific kind of grief that doesn't diminish so much as it becomes part of the architecture of your daily life. Lily came to live with Martha and me shortly after. Raising a grandchild at 52 was not something I had planned for. But I want to be honest with you, it was also one of the great privileges of my life. That little girl with her grandmother's stubbornness and her mother's laugh gave our house a sound it badly needed. Then there was Raymond. Raymond was our second child, born 3 years after Caroline, and from the very beginning he was different from his sister in ways that I tried for a very long time to attribute to personality rather than character. Caroline worked hard because she wanted to earn things. Raymond worked hard when someone was watching and coasted when they weren't. It was a small distinction when he was 10 years old. It became a larger one as he grew. I paid for his college. I co-signed his first apartment lease. When he came to me at 28 saying he wanted to start a landscaping business, I wrote him a check for $15,000 without asking for a repayment schedule because he was my son, and I believed in giving people the chance to prove themselves. The landscaping business lasted 14 months. There were other things after that. Other ventures, other requests, other explanations that always sounded reasonable in the moment and looked different in hindsight. I told myself it was just Raymond finding his way. Some people took longer than others. I knew that. I had patience for it. What I did not have and what I am not proud of missing was a clear picture of who Raymond had become by the time he married Chloe Dawson 4 years ago. Chloe was 31, slim and deliberate, the kind of woman who chose her words the way other people chose investments carefully with an eye toward return. She smiled at all the right moments. She remembered birthdays. She asked thoughtful questions about my work history at the school district, about the warehouse, about how the inventory systems functioned. At the time, I took this as genuine interest. I was 60 years old, and apparently still capable of being foolish in entirely new ways. The marriage seemed to steady Raymond, at least on the surface. He got a job in logistics. The irony of that was not lost on me, and for about a year, things felt almost normal. Martha and I had Raymond and Chloe over for Sunday dinners. Lily would sit in Raymond's old chair and color quietly while the adults talked. Those evenings felt like something real. I understand now that I was watching a performance, that the questions Chloe asked about the warehouse were not curiosity, that Raymond's sudden interest in my retirement plans had nothing to do with concern for my comfort. I understand it now standing on my porch in the Texas summer heat, while a sheriff I barely know waits patiently beside a box that was meant to end my life as I knew it. The worst part, the part that settles in your chest like a stone and does not move, is not the plan they built. People build plans. The worst part is the night before I went into the hospital, when Raymond read my message and said nothing. When he knew I was trying to reach out a hand, and he chose to let me fall. I built 35 years of doing things right. I just never thought to check whether the person I was doing them for was paying attention for the right reasons. Sheriff Miller gave Martha and me a few minutes alone on the porch while he made calls from his cruiser. Martha sat down in the old wooden chair beside the front door, the chair I had repainted twice in the last decade because she liked the color blue, and I liked doing small things that made her happy. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and stared at the floorboards and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she looked up at me and her eyes were red and her jaw was tight with the effort of holding herself together. "How long have you known?" I asked her. I didn't know. Her voice cracked on the second word. "Arthur, I promise you I did not know. When I saw that stamp, I just knew. The way you know something you've been afraid of, without ever letting yourself think it directly." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "He's our son." "I know he is." "That doesn't make this—" She stopped. Started again. "That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," I said. "It does not." We sat with that for a moment, the two of us on the porch of the house we had lived in for 26 years. Down the block, the lawnmower had stopped. The mockingbird had gone quiet. The whole street felt like it was holding its breath. Miller came back up the porch steps with his notebook open. "Mr. Calloway, I've requested a court order, what we call a subpoena, to pull your phone records from your carrier's server. Even when someone deletes a text message from a device, the carrier often retains a copy on their end for a period of time. If there's anything relevant in your message history, we may be able to recover it." He looked at me steadily. "Is there anything in particular you think we should be looking for?" I had been turning something over in my mind since Martha said Raymond's name. Something I had not told anyone yet because I had not been sure it mattered. Now I was sure. "The night before I went into the hospital," I said, "I found something. A paper, a statement from a gambling account I didn't recognize, mixed in with some mail on the kitchen counter. Raymond had been staying here that week while his apartment was being painted. The account was in his name. The balance owed was very large." Miller's pencil stopped moving. "How large?" "Close to $2 million. I said the number the way you say a number that still doesn't feel real even after you've had days to think about it. NFL betting, from what I could read. The previous season." Martha made a sound beside me that was not quite a word. "I didn't confront him in person," I continued. "It was late. He was already asleep in the guest room. I sent him a text message instead." I paused because saying the next part out loud cost me something I had not anticipated it costing. I told him I knew about the debt. I told him to come talk to me in the morning. I told him I would help him, not the way he was probably thinking, but that I would help him figure out a path forward. I asked him to come home. Miller wrote without looking up. "Did he respond?" "No. I checked before I went to sleep. The message showed as read he had opened it at 11:47 that night, but he never responded." I looked out at the oak trees. The next morning I had the stroke. The words sat in the air between us. Miller understood what they meant. I could see it in the slight pause before he wrote the next line in his notebook. "We'll get those records," he said quietly. "If he read that message, we'll be able to show it." What Miller did not tell me then, what he told me 2 days later, after the subpoena had come back, was what else they found when they searched Raymond's car with the warrant that followed. In the glove compartment, folded in half and tucked beneath the vehicle registration, was a receipt from Millhaven Floral and Gift on Commerce Street. The receipt was dated the same morning I had been rushed by ambulance to Brook Regional Hospital. It was a deposit 30% down on a standing funeral arrangement. The note attached to the order read, "For Arthur James Calloway, hold for notification." Miller read it to me in a small room at the county sheriff's office 2 days after I had sat on my porch steps counting a mockingbird's songs. He read it in the same measured, careful voice he used for everything, and when he finished, he set the paper down and looked at me and did not offer any commentary because there was nothing useful to say. My son had ordered my funeral flowers the morning I went into surgery. He had expected me not to come home. And when I did, when the doctors held up their end and I held up mine, and I walked out of that hospital alive, he had moved to the second plan. The one involving the red-wrapped box and the forged passbook and the stamp he had stolen from my own locked cabinet. I sat in that room at the sheriff's office, and I thought about the text message I had sent at 11:47. "I'll help you. Come talk to me." I thought about Raymond reading those words in the dark of my guest room in my house under my roof and choosing silence. Martha reached over and put her hand over mine on the table. Her fingers were cold. Mine were shaking. "He knew you were reaching out," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet, not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who was saying the only thing left worth saying. He knew Arthur, and he still chose this. I turned my hand over and held hers. Yes, I said. He did. I need to back up a little, because I have been telling this story the way memory tells it, not always in order, but in the order that the weight of things demands. The afternoon of the day I came home from the hospital, before the subpoena, and before the receipt from the florist, and before any of the things I would learn in the days that followed, Sheriff Miller asked me a question that seemed simple at the time. "Mr. Calloway," he said, standing in my living room with his hat in his hands, "is there anywhere in this house where you kept anything related to your work at the school district, documents, equipment, anything at all?" I thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "My personal cabinet," I said, "in the study." The cabinet was a heavy steel lockbox, the kind sold at hardware stores for home document storage, about the size of a small file drawer bolted to the wall beside my desk. I had kept it there for 20 years. Inside were my retirement documents, the original signed receipt for the stamp, surrender my commendation letter from the school board, and a few personal items that mattered to me. I kept it locked as a habit more than out of any particular concern. It was simply the kind of man I was, a place for everything, and everything locked in its place. I took my key ring from my jacket pocket and found the small silver key I had used to open that cabinet for 2 decades. I slid it into the lock. It went in smoothly. It turned a quarter of the way. And then it stopped. I tried again. Pulled it out, reinserted it, turned it carefully in both directions, the way you do when you think maybe it is just stiff. The key would not complete the turn. The lock would not open. "Problem?" Miller asked from the doorway. "This is my key," I said. "I have used this key for 20 years. It is not opening." Miller came forward and looked at the key, then at the lock, then at me. He took a pair of latex gloves from his breast pocket. He had been carrying them since he arrived, I realized, and pulled them on. He examined the key carefully, without taking it from my hand. "Mr. Calloway, when did you last open this cabinet successfully?" I thought back. The week before I went into the hospital. I took out my insurance documents because I needed to check something about my Medicare coverage. And between that time and this morning, was anyone else in this house with access to your belongings? I did not have to think long. Raymond was staying here for about a week. He said his apartment was being repainted. Miller straightened up slowly. He got on his radio and requested a forensic technician. While we waited, he asked me not to touch the key or the lock further, and I stepped back and stood in the doorway of my own study, feeling like a guest in a room I had used every day for a quarter century. The technician, a young woman named Patterson, who arrived 40 minutes later with a black case and a methodical manner, examined the key under a magnifying glass, and then compared it against the lock mechanism using a tool I did not recognize. "The key is a duplicate," she said, not looking up from her work. "High-quality casting. Someone made a mold of the original and produced a copy. The copy matches the original in external dimensions, but the internal tooth pattern is off by just enough that it engages the first tumbler and stops." She looked at Miller. "Whoever made this knew what they were doing. At a glance, you would never know it wasn't the original." "What happened to the original?" I asked. Patterson looked at Miller. Miller looked at me. "That," he said carefully, "is what we need to find out." They found the answer 20 minutes later in my storage shed behind the house. Miller had asked if Raymond had access to the shed. I said yes, the key hung on a hook inside the back door, and had always been there. Inside the shed, beneath a workbench where I kept hand tools and paint cans and the general accumulated debris of 30 years of home ownership, there was an old Royal typewriter. Manual black casing, the kind manufactured sometime in the 1960s, that I had inherited from my father, and kept because I could not bring myself to throw away anything that had belonged to him. I had not used that typewriter in years, but someone had. Patterson dusted the keys with fingerprint powder, a fine gray substance she applied with a soft brush, working slowly and thoroughly across each key. The prints came up clearly on the space bar, the return lever, and 8 of the letter keys. "I'll need comparison prints to confirm," she said, "but these are consistent in size and pattern with an adult male." I was 60 years old, and I had lived in that house for 26 years, and I knew without needing a laboratory to tell me whose hands had been on those keys. Miller's phone rang. He stepped outside to take the call. When he came back in, his expression had shifted in a way I was beginning to recognize the careful, neutral look he put on when he had information he was deciding how to deliver. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "do you know a man named Dennis Holt?" The name hit me like a hand on the shoulder from an old friend. Dennis and I worked together at the district warehouse for 35 years. He retired the same year I did. "Why, he's at my office right now," Miller said. "He drove himself down when he heard what was happening. He says he has documents you need to see." He paused. "He also says, and I'm quoting him directly here, that he told you 20 years ago to keep a backup copy of everything, and that you never listened, and that he is extremely irritated about having to be right. Despite everything, despite the stripped key and the dusted typewriter and the receipt for flowers ordered for a funeral I was apparently supposed to have already had." I laughed. It was not a long laugh, but it was real. "That," I said, "sounds exactly like Dennis Holt." Dennis Holt was already sitting in a plastic chair outside Miller's office when we arrived at the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department, and he stood up the moment he saw me with the particular speed of a man who had been waiting impatiently and was not going to pretend otherwise. He was 63 years old, heavy-set, with a white mustache he had been growing since 1989, and a permanent expression of mild dissatisfaction that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for anger. People who did know him understood it was simply how his face worked when he was paying attention. "You look terrible," he said by way of greeting. "I just had a stroke," I said. "I know." He grabbed my right hand and shook it firmly, the way men of our generation shook hands, one pump solid, no lingering. "I came as soon as I heard." He held up a manila folder. "And I brought this." Inside the folder was a document I had not seen in 6 years. It was the original surrender receipt for the Millhaven County School District Warehouse Authorization Stamp, dated the day of my retirement, signed by me, countersigned by my supervisor, Harold Briggs, and by the district records clerk, and stamped with the district's administrative seal. Every line filled in correctly. Every signature in its proper place. Dennis had kept his copy in a fireproof box in his garage because, as he explained to Miller with considerable satisfaction, he had always believed that a man in a position of trust should document everything twice. "I told him that for 35 years, Dennis said, nodding at me. "He listened about 60% of the time." 65, I said. Miller took the folder and examined the document carefully. "This directly contradicts the premise that Mr. Calloway retained the stamp after retirement." "That's why I brought it," Dennis said, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a reasonably intelligent person. We were still standing in the hallway outside Miller's office when his deputy appeared at the far end of the corridor. Young man, mid-20s, moving with the brisk walk of someone carrying information he needed to deliver quickly. "Sheriff," he said. "The Calloway residents, Raymond Calloway, and a woman just pulled up. They're on the porch." Miller looked at me. "You want to be there?" "Yes," I said. "Absolutely yes." We drove back to Clover Ridge Road in Miller's cruiser, Dennis following in his own truck, because he refused to be left out, and because, as he pointed out, nobody had told him to go home. When we pulled into the driveway, Raymond and Chloe were standing on the porch. Raymond had his hands in his jacket pockets and wore an expression of deep concern that I recognized immediately as the same expression he had worn at 16 when he had dented my truck and was trying to decide how to tell me about it. Chloe stood beside him with her arms crossed, wearing a light gray cardigan despite the summer heat, her dark hair pulled back. She was watching the cruiser pull in with eyes that were calculating something. I could see it in the way they moved quick, and assessing the way eyes move when a person is not reacting to a situation, but managing it. "Dad." Raymond came down the porch steps toward me with his arms open. "Dad? I just heard, are you all right?" "We came as soon as we could." He reached for me. I stepped back. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. I simply took one step back, and the look that crossed Raymond's face in that half-second surprise recalibration, a decision being made, told me more than an hour of conversation would have. "Raymond," I said. "Chloe." I looked at them both. "Why don't we all go inside?" It was not a question. We stood in the living room, Miller and his deputy near the door, Dennis beside the bookcase with his arms folded and his expression of mild dissatisfaction cranked up several degrees, Raymond and Chloe on one side of the coffee table, Martha and I on the other. Raymond was talking. He was good at talking. He had always been good at talking, filling space with words, the way some people fill silence with music, not because the words meant anything in particular, but because silence made him uncomfortable. He was saying something about how worried he had been, how he wished he had known sooner about the hospitalization, how he hoped the police would get to the bottom of whoever had put that terrible box on our porch. I was not listening to the words. I was watching Chloe's hands. She had her arms crossed, which was how I had first noticed it, the way her right hand tucked under her left elbow, fingers curled slightly inward. There was something along the edge of her right thumbnail and in the crease of her first knuckle. A color. Dark reddish-brown, the particular shade of old ink caught in the fine lines of her skin, where soap and water had not fully reached. I knew that color. I had seen it on my own hands dozens of times over 35 years. It was the ink from the Millhaven County School District warehouse authorization stamp. A specialty formulation, viscous oil-based, designed to produce clear impressions on rough paper stock. It was also, as every person who had ever used it could tell you, extraordinarily difficult to remove completely from skin. It settled into the creases of your fingers and stayed there for days. "Sheriff Miller," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Raymond stopped talking. "Could you ask Chloe to show you her hands?" The room went very still. Chloe's eyes moved to me for exactly 1 second, flat, fast, calculating, and then she smiled and unfolded her arms and held out both hands, palms up, in a gesture designed to look cooperative. Miller leaned forward. He looked at her right hand for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "What is that on your thumb and first finger?" "Ink," Chloe said. "I was doing an art project." "What kind of ink?" "Just ink. Crafting ink. From a hobby store." Dennis Holt made a sound from beside the bookcase. It was not quite a laugh. Miller straightened up and looked at Chloe with the expression of a man who had heard a great many explanations in 18 years of law enforcement and was fully capable of telling the difference between one that was true and one that had been prepared in advance. "We'll want to have a sample of that analyzed," he said, in the same calm voice he used for everything. "For comparison purposes." Raymond reached into his jacket pocket. I think he meant to get his phone, and a folded piece of paper came with it, caught on the pocket lining, and fell to the floor between us. He moved to pick it up. Miller's deputy got there first. The deputy unfolded it, read it, and handed it to Miller without a word. Miller read it. Then he looked at Raymond with an expression I had not yet seen on his face, something harder than careful, something that had made a decision. "Mr. Calloway," he said, and he was looking at Raymond, not at me. "I'm going to need you to remain here while we make some calls." Raymond's face went the color of old chalk. I looked at the paper in Miller's hand. I could not read it from where I stood, but I did not need to. I already knew what it was. The figure on that paper, nearly $2 million owed to a private sports betting operation, was the exact same figure that appeared on the forged passbook in the box on my porch. The number that explained everything. Raymond and Chloe left our house that evening without being arrested. I want to be clear about that, because I know how it sounds. Miller explained it to me in the driveway after they had gone, while Dennis sat on the hood of his truck eating a gas station sandwich he had produced from somewhere and listening without pretending not to. "Right now," Miller said, "we have a forged document, a suspicious stamp, a key that was duplicated without your knowledge, and a debt receipt that fell out of your son's pocket. That is significant. That is not yet sufficient." He looked at me steadily. "I need you to understand the difference." "I understand the difference," I said. "I spent 35 years in a system that ran on documentation. I know what sufficient means." He nodded once. "Then you know we are going to get there. We just need to do it right." I slept badly that night. Martha sat up with me until after midnight, the two of us at the kitchen table with decaf coffee and the particular silence of people who have too much to say and are too exhausted to say any of it. At some point, she reached across the table and put her hand on my arm and said, "We are going to be all right, Arthur." I did not tell her I was not sure I believed that yet. Some kindnesses are worth receiving without argument. The following morning, Sheriff Miller called me at 7:45. "Dr. Thorne is here," he said. "She came in on her own. Said she had something she needed to tell us and didn't want to wait for a formal request." I signed the medical authorization form that Miller's deputy slid across the table to me, a standard HIPAA release, allowing Dr. Thorne to share my medical records with the sheriff's department in connection with the investigation. The form was one page straightforward, and I signed it with my left hand because my right was still unreliable enough that I did not trust it with anything that needed to be legible. Dr. Thorne was already in the conference room when I arrived. She had her reading glasses on and a folder open in front of her, and the focused, contained expression of someone who had organized her thoughts carefully before speaking and intended to deliver them in order. "Mr. Calloway," she said, standing briefly, "I owe you an apology." I sat down across from her. "For what?" "For the first night after your surgery." She took her glasses off and held them in both hands. "You woke up around 2 in the morning. You asked me if anyone had called your family. I told you they were probably on their way." She paused. "They were not on their way. I knew that. The nursing staff had attempted to reach your emergency contacts 3 times during the procedure and received no answer from anyone. I chose to tell you something easier because you had just come through a significant medical event, and I did not think the truth would serve you at that moment." She put her glasses back on. "I have been reconsidering that decision ever since. Dr. Thorne," I said, "you kept me calm when I needed to be calm. There is nothing to apologize for." She looked at me for a moment. Then she opened the folder. "The MRI results from your admission are here," she said, turning the folder so Miller and I could both see. "The stroke affected a specific cluster of neurons in the region of your brain that governs fine motor control in the right hand. The result is what we call a localized resting tremor, an involuntary rhythmic shaking of the hand that occurs particularly during sustained grip activities such as writing." She placed a second sheet beside the MRI. It was a printout of the bank transaction records, the withdrawals that had been made from the account established in my name during the 3 days I had been hospitalized. These signatures, she said, pointing to the signature lines on the transaction records, are consistent, controlled, and exhibit no tremor pattern whatsoever. The pen pressure is even throughout. The letter formations are fluid. She looked up at Miller. I have been reading the output of neurological conditions for 20 years. The person who signed these documents did not have a resting tremor. Mr. Calloway, on the dates these transactions were executed, most certainly did. Miller leaned forward. Would you be willing to put that in a written statement and testify to it if necessary? I drove here at 6:45 in the morning without being asked. Dr. Thorne said, with a dryness I had not previously witnessed from her, I think we can assume I am willing. Miller's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, then stood. Excuse me one moment. Dr. Thorne and I sat in the conference room while he stepped out. She closed the folder and looked at me with the directness that seemed to be simply her natural mode of operation. How is the tremor today? She asked. I held up my right hand. It shook slightly, not dramatically, but visibly. Same as yesterday. That is actually encouraging, she said. Consistency suggests the affected area is stable. With the right therapy, there is a reasonable chance of significant improvement over time. She paused. I want you to come in next week for a follow-up, not as part of any investigation, just as my patient. I will, I said. Miller came back into the room with the particular energy of a man who had just received information that changed the shape of something. That was a woman named Gloria Reyes, he said, sitting back down. She is a senior teller at the branch of Millhaven First National on Commerce Street. She says she personally handled all 4 of the withdrawal transactions on the account in question. He looked at me. She wants to come in. She says she has something to tell us that is not on any of the security footage. Dr. Thorne and I looked at each other across the table. Then I imagine, I said, you should let her come in. Miller was already dialing. Outside the conference room window, Millhaven was going about its Tuesday morning, the way small Texas towns went about Tuesday mornings, unhurried, sun-bleached, entirely unaware that in a room faust off the main corridor of the county sheriff's department, the distance between accusation and truth was closing by the hour. Gloria Reyes arrived at the sheriff's department 40 minutes after Miller's call, which told me something about the kind of woman she was before she had spoken a single word. She was 44 years old, compact and carefully dressed with dark hair threaded through with early gray, and the posture of someone who had spent 2 decades standing behind a counter and had learned to carry herself with quiet authority. She sat down across from Miller and me in the conference room and placed her hands flat on the table and looked at me directly, which was the second thing that told me something about her. Mr. Calloway, she said, I have been at Millhaven First National for 18 years. In that time, I have served a great many customers. I do not typically remember individual transactions in detail. She paused. I remember yours. Tell me, I said. She had handled all 4 of the withdrawal transactions personally. The account had been flagged for her attention because the amounts were large, each withdrawal between $40,000 and $60,000, and the branch manager required senior teller authorization for any cash transaction above $25,000. She had processed the paperwork, verified the identification presented, and completed each transaction according to standard procedure. The identification was correct, she said. Driver's license matching account number matching Social Security last 4. Everything I am trained to check was in order. Her jaw tightened slightly. That is what has been keeping me awake. You followed your training, I said. Nobody is faulting you for that. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she was faulting herself regardless of what anyone else thought, and that this was not something a polite reassurance was going to resolve. The person who came in, she said carefully, had a medical pressure bandage wrapped over her left jaw and chin. She explained she had just undergone major oral surgery that morning, which left her lower face swollen and bruised. She briefly lowered the edge of the wrap so I could verify her identity against the driver's license, then covered it again. She was well-dressed, composed, and entirely convincing. She apologized for her appearance. She was well-dressed, composed, and entirely convincing. Gloria's hands pressed flatter against the table. But there is something she could not fake. Something I noticed each time and did not understand the significance of until I saw the news report this morning about your situation. Miller leaned forward. What was that? Her hands, Gloria said. Both times I slid the transaction forms across the counter for signature, I watched her sign. The signature was quick, fluid, and completely steady. No hesitation, no variation in pressure, no tremor of any kind. She looked at me. Mr. Calloway, you have been a customer at our branch for 11 years. I have helped you personally on many occasions. The first time I ever assisted you, you were opening a certificate of deposit perhaps 7 years ago. You apologized because your hand shook slightly when you signed. You said it had always done that even before the stroke. A mild, essential tremor, you called it. The room was very quiet. I thought about that. Gloria continued, her voice steady, but her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears, but was close to them. Every time that woman stood at my window, I thought about it afterward and told myself I was being foolish, that people's hands behave differently on different days, that I was looking for problems that were not there. She took a breath. I should have trusted what I noticed. Ms. Reyes, Miller said quietly, you are here now. That is what matters. She nodded once sharply like someone accepting a verdict. Miller excused himself briefly and returned with a document. I want to show you something we obtained this morning. He explained for my benefit as much as hers that the probable cause established by the previous day's evidence, the forged passbook, the duplicated key, the debt receipt, the ink on Chloe's hand, had been sufficient for a magistrate to issue a search warrant for Raymond's vehicle at 6 that morning. The warrant had been executed at 7:15, while Raymond and Chloe were presumably still at home, believing they had weathered the worst of it. Inside the glove compartment, deputies had found the florist receipt I already knew about, but it was the dashboard camera that had changed everything. The camera was a mid-range model, the kind that recorded continuously while the vehicle was in motion and stored the last 72 hours of footage on a loop. Raymond had borrowed my Subaru for the week he stayed at our house, and during that week he had driven Chloe to the bank. Miller turned his laptop toward us. The footage was grainy, shot from the driver's perspective, time-stamped in the upper right corner. It showed the main block of Commerce Street on a Tuesday morning, bright summer light, moderate traffic. The vehicle slowed and stopped in front of Millhaven First National. The passenger door opened. A woman stepped out. She wore a light blouse and dark slacks and had white medical bandaging wrapped around the lower half of her face. She moved purposefully toward the bank entrance without looking up at the camera she had no reason to know existed. I recognized the way she moved before I registered anything else. The set of her shoulders, the particular angle of her chin above the bandaging, the deliberate, managed quality of every step Chloe had always walked, as if she was aware of being watched, and even in disguise that habit did not leave her. That's Chloe, I said. My voice came out flat and certain. That is my daughter-in-law. Gloria Reyes leaned forward and looked at the screen. She studied it for a long moment. Her right hand, still flat on the table, curled slowly into a fist. That, she said, is the woman who stood at my window. Miller stopped the footage. The timestamp in the corner read 10:47 on a Tuesday morning, the exact date and time of the second withdrawal transaction, a figure I had already memorized, because I had been reading and rereading the bank records until the numbers felt burned into the back of my eyes. "Sheriff," I said, "how much more do you need?" Miller closed the laptop. He looked at me across the table with the expression of a man who had spent 18 years being careful and was now finally satisfied that carefulness had been rewarded. "We're getting close, Mr. Calloway," he said. "We are getting very close." Dennis was still at the sheriff's department when Miller and I came out of the conference room that afternoon. He had made himself at home in the waiting area with a cup of coffee from the break room that someone had apparently offered him a newspaper he had apparently found somewhere, and the settled, unhurried manner of a man who had decided he was staying until further notice and was comfortable with that decision. He looked up when he saw us. "Good news or complicated news?" he asked. "Complicated news that is trending toward good," I said. He nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. "Sit down. You look like you've been standing too long." I sat. Miller excused himself to make calls, and for a few minutes it was just Dennis and me in the plastic chairs of the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department waiting area, which smelled of old coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, and had a motivational poster on the wall about integrity that I found under the circumstances either deeply appropriate or deeply ironic. I could not decide which. "You doing all right?" Dennis asked. "No," I said, "but I think I'm going to be." He reached over and put a hand on my shoulder. For exactly 2 seconds, the Dennis Holt version of a lengthy, emotional expression, and then went back to his newspaper. The following morning, Miller called me at the house before 8. "I need you to come in," he said. "We've been going through the hospital records. There are some things you should hear in person." Martha drove me. She had insisted on it with the particular quiet firmness she used when she had made a decision and was not interested in discussing alternatives. I did not argue. My right hand was steadier than it had been the day before, but my chest felt like something heavy had taken up residence inside it overnight, and I was not entirely confident in my own judgment about what I was and was not capable of handling alone. Miller was waiting in the conference room with 2 deputies and a folder that was thicker than yesterday's. He waited until Martha and I were seated before he opened it. "Brook Regional Hospital provided their visitor access records voluntarily," he said. "The maternity and intensive care units use an electronic badge system. Every visitor swipes a card at the floor entrance, which creates a time-stamped log. We cross-referenced the log with the names of your emergency contacts and family members for the 3 days you were hospitalized." He turned the folder toward us and slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. I looked at it. I ran my finger down the column of names. I found Martha's entry she had visited on the evening of the first day, swiped in at 6:43, swiped out at 7:29. 46 minutes. I had known she came. I had not known she left so quickly, and something about seeing those precise timestamps made my chest ache in a way I had not anticipated. I kept looking. I went through the entire 3-day log twice. Raymond's name was not there. "He never came," I said. The words came out very quiet. Not shocked, I had suspected as much for days, but there is a particular kind of pain that lives in the distance between suspecting something and having it confirmed in black and white on a government spreadsheet. That pain settled somewhere beneath my sternum and stayed there. "He never badged into the unit," Miller said carefully. "That is what the record shows." Martha made a sound beside me. Small, involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when something lands harder than expected. She reached under the table and found my hand. "He posted a photograph," I said, "on Facebook, of himself at the hospital. There were comments. People told him what a devoted son he was." Miller nodded. We pulled the post. The photograph was taken in the first-floor main corridor, a public area, no badge required. The timestamp on the image metadata matches a Tuesday afternoon, which was your second day in the ICU. The intensive care unit is on the 4th floor. He paused. He took a photograph in the lobby and told the people who commented that he was there for you. I thought about those 47 likes, those 12 comments, prayers for your family. You're such a good son. Your dad is lucky to have you. He was performing, I said, for an audience he thought would never check. Yes, Miller said, that appears to be the case. Dennis, who had insisted on coming with us and had been sitting in the corner so quietly I had almost forgotten he was there, cleared his throat. Can I say something? Miller looked at him. Go ahead. In 35 years of working with Arthur Calloway, Dennis said, in the deliberate voice he used when he wanted to make sure every word landed where he intended it, I never once saw that man do a single thing that needed to be hidden. Not one. He looked at Miller. I just want that on record somewhere. Miller wrote something in his notebook. Noted Mr. Holt. The GPS question came up an hour later when one of Miller's deputies returned from the records room with a second folder. The court order for cell site location data issued by a county magistrate that morning under the standard established by federal case law, requiring judicial authorization for historical location records, had come back with results. The anonymous call to the sheriff's department on the morning I came home from the hospital had been made from a prepaid device. The device was not registered in Chloe's name. But, the deputy said, setting the folder on the table, the cell tower data places that device at the intersection of Clover Ridge Road and Maple Street at the exact time of the call, which is 1 block from your house. I looked at Miller. Chloe was at my house, I said. She was already there when I got home. She must have made the call from outside before coming to the door. That is the most consistent interpretation of this data, yes, Miller said. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the same kind of suspended tile ceiling they had in my hospital room. I noticed pale white and slightly yellowed at the edges, and I thought about how much planning had gone into the morning. I came home. The box prepared in advance, the call timed to follow mine. The photograph already posted, the performance already rehearsed. All of it ready, all of it waiting. For me to walk up my own porch steps and into a trap that had been built piece by people who had sat at my kitchen table and eaten my food and called me Dad. Miller's voice brought me back. Mr. Calloway, there's one more thing. I looked at him. We found something in the hospital records that connects directly to the bank transactions. He opened the 3rd folder. And I think you're going to want to hear this before tomorrow. The 3rd folder did not contain what I expected. I had been bracing myself for more bank records, more transaction logs, more timestamps and account numbers and the cold arithmetic of fraud laid out in columns on government paper. I had been in that conference room long enough that my mind had begun processing information the way it processed inventory reports efficiently, without flinching, one line at a time. What Miller slid across the table instead was a single page, a photocopy of a document header official-looking, with the seal of a Millhaven notary office in the upper left corner. This came from the county records office this morning, he said. Routine cross-reference of your name against recent filings. It flagged something. I looked at the header, at the date, at the document type listed beneath the seal. Last will and testament of Arthur James Calloway, filed for registration 6 months ago. I did not file a will 6 months ago, I said. I know, Miller said. Your attorney did, however, receive a call from our office this morning asking him to bring the original document he holds for you. He should be here within the hour. Thomas Garner arrived in 45 minutes, which I appreciated, because Thomas was a man who understood that some things did not benefit from delay. He was 67 years old, semi-retired, with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had spent 4 decades reading documents that other people had signed without reading carefully enough. He had drawn up my original will 11 years ago and updated it twice since, once when Caroline died and once when Lily came to live with us permanently. He set his briefcase on the conference table, opened it, and removed a manila envelope with my name written across the front in his own handwriting. He placed it beside the photocopy Miller had provided. Then he put his reading glasses on and looked at both documents for a long time without speaking. "Thomas," I said finally, "tell me." He took his glasses off, cleaned them with his tie, put them back on. These were the gestures of a man buying himself a moment he needed. "Arthur," he said, "the document in the county records office is not the will I drafted for you. It is not the will you signed in my office. It shares your name and some of your identifying information, but the contents are substantially different." He turned the photocopy toward me and pointed to 3 lines near the bottom of the page. "Under this version, your entire estate passes to Raymond Allen Calloway upon your death. Martha is not named as a beneficiary. Lily is not named as a beneficiary." Martha's hand found my arm under the table. I read the lines Thomas was pointing to. I read them again. The words were clear and unambiguous in the way that legal language is sometimes brutally clear. There was no interpretation required, no nuance to untangle. Under this document, if I had died in that hospital, which Raymond had apparently considered a reasonable possibility given the florist receipt, everything I had spent 60 years building would have gone directly to the son who had ordered my funeral flowers before my surgery was finished, and Lily would have had nothing. I set the paper down very carefully, the way I had set down the contents of the red-wrapped box on my porch railing 5 days earlier. The same deliberate care. The same need to keep my hands occupied so they would not shake. "The signatures on this version," Thomas continued, his voice even and professional, in the way that people are professional when they are working hard to hold a difficult room together, "include 2 witness signatures that are required under Texas law for a valid will. I have compared them against the witness signatures on your legitimate document. They are not the same individuals." He paused. "Furthermore, the notary stamp on this version belongs to a Millhaven office that ceased operation 14 months ago. Whoever prepared this document used an outdated stamp, either from a stolen supply or from records that were not properly destroyed when the office closed," Miller wrote steadily in his notebook. "Can you establish when the substitution occurred?" "The county filing date is 6 months ago," Thomas said, "which would place it approximately 2 months after Raymond borrowed my client's vehicle to transport what he described as," Thomas checked his notes, "family paperwork to a downtown office." I remembered that afternoon. Raymond had asked to borrow the Subaru for a few hours, said he needed to drop some things off downtown, and his car was making a noise he didn't trust on the highway. I had handed him the keys without hesitation, because he was my son, and I trusted him the way you trust someone you raised, which is completely and without conditions right up until the moment you discover you should not have. "He used my car," I said, "to file a forged will in my name." "That appears to be what happened," Thomas said quietly. The room held that for a moment. Outside the window, a deputy walked across the parking lot carrying a coffee cup. A truck went by on the street. The ordinary world continuing to turn. "Thomas," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was something I seemed to be managing consistently these days, a steadiness on the outside that did not reflect what was happening underneath. "If I had not survived the surgery, if the stroke had been worse or the procedure had gone differently," I stopped, started again. What would have happened to Lily? Thomas looked at me over the top of his glasses. Under this document, he said, Lily would not have received anything from your estate. The trust you established for her education and care would have been subject to legal challenge under the terms of this version. He chose his next words carefully. It is possible she would have been provided for through other means. It is also possible she would not have been. Martha made a sound beside me that I had not heard from her in a very long time. It was the sound she had made when we got the call about Caroline. Low, involuntary from somewhere that had nothing to do with composure or dignity or holding yourself together in front of other people. I reached over and put both arms around her right hand, trembling slightly against her shoulder, and I held on. Fix it, I said to Thomas over Martha's head. Whatever needs to be filed, whatever needs to be corrected, fix it today. Already in progress, he said. I called my office from the parking lot. Miller closed his notebook. He looked at me with the expression he wore when he had absorbed something that required a moment before it could be acted upon. Mr. Calloway, he said, I think we now have enough for the next step. What's the next step? I asked. We're going to need your wife's help, he said. There is a question I have been asked more than any other since all of this became public. People ask it in different ways, some bluntly, some carefully, some with the particular hesitancy of people who are not sure they want to hear the answer. But they are all asking the same thing. Why? Why would a son do this to his father? What kind of person builds a trap like that and waits for his own parent to walk into it? I have spent more time than I should have trying to answer that question. Not for other people. For myself. Miller walked me through the financial picture on the morning of the 6th day in the same conference room that had become something like a second home to me over the past week. Martha sat beside me. Thomas Garner sat at the end of the table with his briefcase open. Dennis had driven himself over again and was in the waiting area with his newspaper, because Dennis had apparently decided that his retirement included being available at all hours for situations of this nature. Raymond's debt to the betting operation accumulated over approximately 14 months, Miller said, laying a summary sheet on the table. It began with smaller amounts during the NFL preseason, 5,000, 8,000 amounts, that were recoverable if the season went well. The season did not go well for Raymond. By the playoffs, he owed considerably more. By the time the Super Bowl was over, the total had reached the figure on the receipt Deputy Garza recovered from his jacket. Just under $2 million, I said. $1,940,000, Miller confirmed. These operations do not extend credit indefinitely. Raymond had been receiving collection pressure for several months before your hospitalization. The people he owed were not the kind of people who file civil suits. I understood what that meant. I had lived in Millhaven long enough to know that certain kinds of debt did not resolve themselves through lawyers and payment plans. Why didn't he come to me? I asked. Not with anger. I had moved past the anger by then, or at least past the first layer of it. I asked it the way you ask a question, when you genuinely do not understand the answer. I told him in that text message. I said I would help him. Miller looked at me steadily. We believed the debt had already progressed beyond the point where your help could have resolved it conventionally. The operation he owed money to was not interested in partial payments or structured arrangements. They wanted the full amount, and they wanted it within a time frame that was not compatible with any legitimate solution. Thomas leaned forward. There's also the matter of what Arthur actually owned versus what Raymond believed he could access. Miller nodded. That is the second piece. He put another sheet on the table. It was a simplified breakdown of my estate, the kind of document that feels strange to look at when you are still alive and sitting in a chair because it reduces 60 years of working and saving and careful decision-making into a column of numbers. The house on Clover Ridge Road, a rental property on the east side of Millhaven that Martha and I had purchased 12 years ago as a retirement investment. A modest investment account, and the educational trust I had established for Lily 3 years after Carolyn died, funded to a level that would cover her schooling, her housing, and a reasonable start in adult life structured specifically as an irrevocable trust under Texas law. The trust is the key, Thomas said. An irrevocable trust once established cannot be dissolved, redirected, or accessed by anyone other than the designated beneficiary. Not by Raymond. Not by a court order in most circumstances. Not even by Arthur himself, technically, without specific provisions. He looked at me over his glasses. Arthur set it up that way deliberately, to protect Lily. I did, I said. Raymond could not touch that trust under any normal circumstances, Thomas continued. The only scenarios under which the trust becomes legally vulnerable are extremely narrow. One of them is if the grantor Arthur is convicted of financial crimes involving the trust assets. Another is if the grantor is declared legally incapacitated and the trust terms are challenged during estate proceedings. Miller picked up from there. So Raymond needed one of two things. Either Arthur convicted of a crime, which is what the forged passbook and the fabricated embezzlement scheme were designed to accomplish, or Arthur dead, with a forged will in place that gave Raymond control of the estate before anyone examined the trust documents too carefully. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, a mockingbird landed on the parking lot light post and sat there doing what mockingbirds do, cycling through every song it had ever learned one after another, as if it could not decide which one fit the moment best. I had built that trust to protect Lily, to make sure that whatever happened to me, she would have something solid underneath her. I had sat in Thomas's office 3 years after Carolyn's funeral and signed those documents with the specific intention that no circumstance, no unexpected death, no creditor, no family dispute would leave that child without a foundation. Raymond had looked at the thing I built to protect his niece and seen an obstacle. He didn't just want my money, I said. The words came out slow, the way words come out when you are saying something for the first time that you have been circling around for days. He wanted to dismantle everything I built. The trust, the property, the will, all of it. He needed me either in prison or in the ground. Yes, Miller said. Simply, without embellishment. Martha reached over and covered my hand with hers. Her fingers were warm this time, not cold, the way they had been in that room 2 days ago. I did not know if that meant she had found some steadiness or if she had simply run out of cold. There is something else, Miller said after a moment. He looked almost uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. We pulled Raymond's financial records going back 3 years. The debt did not begin with the NFL betting. There were earlier losses, smaller operations, a pattern that goes back further than the 14 months I mentioned. I looked at him. How much further? At least 3 years, Miller said, which means Raymond was in significant financial trouble before Lily's trust was fully funded. He paused. It is possible, Mr. Calloway, that the trust itself, your decision to protect Lily, accelerated his desperation. He may have seen the trust as money being placed permanently beyond his reach. I thought about that. About the Sunday dinners where Raymond had seemed interested in my retirement plans. About the questions Chloe had asked about the warehouse, about my accounts, about how I managed things. About all the small moments I had read as curiosity and family interest that had been something else entirely. He watched me build it, I said, and he decided he deserved it. Miller closed the folder. He looked at me with the particular directness he used when he had something important to say and intended to say it plainly. Mr. Calloway, tomorrow we move to the next phase. Martha has agreed to help us, but I want to make sure you understand what that means before we proceed. I straightened in my chair. "Tell me," I said. "I have never been a man who cried easily. Not at funerals, not even Caroline's, where I had held myself together through the service and the burial and the long, terrible afternoon afterward, by the simple mechanism of having too many things to do and too many people to hold up to allow myself the luxury of falling apart. Not at setbacks or disappointments or the various reversals that 60 years of living will deliver to any person who sticks around long enough to receive them. I cried on the morning of the 7th day, sitting in Miller's conference room, listening to a recording of my 8-year-old granddaughter tell the truth. Miller had called me at 7 that morning. His voice had the careful, measured quality it took on when he was about to deliver something that required preparation to receive. "Something came in overnight," he said, "from the elementary school. I need you to come in and I need you to bring Martha." Miss Patricia Webb had been Lily's third-grade teacher at Millhaven Elementary for 11 years. She was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of teacher that small towns produced in disproportionate numbers, patient, observant, the sort of woman who noticed things about children that the children themselves did not know they were communicating. On the afternoon of the 6th day, Lily had stayed late after school to help arrange the classroom bookshelf, which was something she did on Tuesdays because she liked the smell of books and liked having a reason to stay in a place that felt orderly and calm. Ms. Webb had asked the way teachers ask things casually without pressure while doing something else, whether Lily was doing all right, whether things were okay at home. Lily had said that things were a little confusing right now. Ms. Webb had kept arranging books and kept listening, which was the right thing to do. What Lily said next triggered what Texas law called a mandatory report, a legal obligation placed on teachers, counselors, and other professionals who work with children to report to authorities any disclosure that suggested a child's safety or welfare might be at risk. Ms. Webb had called the school counselor. The counselor had called the district office. The district office had called the sheriff's department. By 9 o'clock that evening, Miller had a documented statement and a request for a formal interview. The interview had been conducted that morning at the Millhaven Child Advocacy Center, a separate facility from the sheriff's department designed specifically for situations involving child witnesses. Trained forensic interviewers worked there, people who knew how to talk to children in ways that gathered accurate information without leading or pressuring. Arthur was not present. Martha was not present. I understood the protocol and I agreed with it, even though sitting in Miller's waiting room during those 40 minutes was one of the harder things I had done in a week that had contained a great many hard things. Miller played the recording in the conference room with Martha and me and Thomas Garner and Dennis, who had arrived with coffee and pastries from the bakery on Elm Street, because, as he explained, people needed to eat regardless of circumstances. The interviewer's voice was calm and unhurried. Lily's voice was the same voice I heard every weekend across my kitchen table, slightly higher than it would eventually settle, with the particular cadence of a child who had learned to think before she spoke. The interviewer asked Lily if she could tell her about the last time she stayed at her grandfather's house. Lily said it was the weekend before Grandpa Bear went to the hospital. The interviewer asked what she remembered about that weekend. Lily said she remembered that Uncle Raymond came over on Saturday afternoon. She said Grandpa Bear was outside in the backyard, and she was watching television in the living room when Uncle Raymond came inside. She said he went down the hallway toward Grandpa Bear's bedroom. She said she thought that was a little strange because Grandpa Bear was outside and Uncle Raymond didn't say anything to her when he came in, which was unusual because Uncle Raymond usually said hello. The interviewer asked how long Uncle Raymond was in the hallway. Lily said not very long, maybe 5 minutes. When he came back out, he was carrying something in his hand, but she couldn't see what it was because he put it in his jacket pocket quickly. She said he looked at her and told her that Grandpa Bear had asked him to get something from the bedroom. Then he said, and Lily's voice dropped slightly, hear the way a child's voice drops. When they are repeating something, they understood they were not supposed to share. He said that she shouldn't mention it to Grandpa Bear, because it was going to be a surprise. Martha's hand tightened on my arm. The interviewer asked if Lily had told anyone else about this before today. Lily said no. She said she had tried not to think about it, because she didn't want to ruin the surprise. But then she heard her aunt talking on the phone at home about Grandpa Bear being in trouble with the police, and she got scared. And she told Ms. Webb because Ms. Webb always said that if something felt wrong in your stomach, it was okay to say so. The interviewer asked Lily one more question. She asked if Lily wanted to say anything else about her grandfather. There was a pause on the recording. Brief, maybe 4 seconds. The kind of pause that a child takes when she is deciding whether something is too big to say out loud. Then Lily said, "Grandpa Bear never leaves me alone. Even when I was really little, and I didn't understand why Mama wasn't coming back, he just stayed. He always just stayed." Miller reached over and stopped the playback. The room was not quiet in the way rooms are quiet when nothing is happening. It was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something has just happened that everybody present will remember for the rest of their lives. I pressed the back of my right hand against my mouth. My left hand was flat on the table, and Dennis put his hand over it, without saying anything, which was the second time in a week he had touched my hand, and the second time it had been exactly the right thing. Martha was crying openly beside me, not trying to stop, not apologizing for it. Thomas Garner took his glasses off and set them on the table and looked at the wall. "She's 8 years old," I said when I could speak. My voice came out rough and uneven. She carried that by herself for a week, because she thought it was a surprise. She also, Miller said quietly, just confirmed that Raymond entered your bedroom on the Saturday before your hospitalization, which is the same weekend we believe the key was duplicated. He said it gently. He understood what the evidence meant. He also understood that in that moment, the evidence was not the thing that mattered most. What mattered most was that a little girl who had already lost her mother had looked at the people around her, decided who was telling the truth, and chosen her grandfather. I have been married to Martha Calloway for 38 years. In that time, I have seen her face down a school board that wanted to cut the music program. I have seen her sit with a dying woman, her own mother, for 11 days straight, without sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. I have seen her raise a grandchild from infancy after losing a daughter, and do it without complaint, without martyrdom, without asking anyone to acknowledge how hard it was. I thought I knew what she was capable of. I was wrong in the best possible way. Miller explained the plan to us on the afternoon of the 7th day after the recording had been played, and the room had settled, and everyone had collected themselves enough to think clearly again. Raymond had called Martha 4 times in the past week. Each time the message was the same, delivered with varying degrees of urgency and thinly veiled threat. He needed her to tell investigators that Arthur had been showing signs of confusion before the hospitalization, that he had mentioned opening new accounts, that his memory had not been reliable. He needed her to help build the story that would make the forgery believable. Martha had told him each time that she needed to think about it, that it was a lot to ask, that she wasn't sure she could do it. She had been stalling, deliberately, waiting. Under Texas law, Miller explained, setting a 1-page document on the table in front of Martha. A person who is a party to a conversation may record that conversation without the knowledge or consent of the other parties. This is called one-party consent. What you would be doing is entirely legal. The recording would be admissible as evidence. He looked at her steadily. "But I want to be clear, no one is asking you to do this. It is your decision and yours alone." Martha picked up the document. "Read it. Set it down." "I want to do it." she said. Not quickly, not dramatically, in the same quiet, firm voice she used when she had made a decision and was done deliberating. I have been thinking about how to help since the morning I saw that box on the porch. This is how I can help. She looked at me across the table. Arthur, she said, do you trust me? Martha. I said, you are the only person in this situation I trust completely. She nodded once. Then she turned back to Miller. Tell me exactly what you need. The meeting with Raymond and Chloe was arranged for the following morning. Martha called Raymond that evening and told him she had made a decision, that she had thought about what he was asking and she was willing to talk. Her voice on that call was steady and convincing in a way that made me understand sitting beside her at the kitchen table that I had underestimated her ability to protect the people she loved. Raymond agreed immediately. He suggested the Briar Rose Diner on Highway 9, a place we had eaten Sunday breakfast for 20 years, chosen presumably because it was familiar and comfortable, and because Raymond associated it with a version of his mother who would not turn against him. He was about to discover that version had made her decision 5 days ago on a porch in front of a red-wrapped box. Miller arrived at our house at 7:15 the following morning, with a deputy and a small case. The recording device was smaller than I expected, a flat unit no larger than a deck of cards designed to be worn against the body beneath clothing. The deputy, a woman named Torres, who had a calm, efficient manner that reminded me of Dr. Thorne, explained how it worked and helped Martha position it correctly. The whole process took 11 minutes. Martha stood in our kitchen afterward in her blue cardigan, the same one she had been wearing the day she came home and saw the box, and let me straighten the collar, the way I had straightened her collar before important occasions for 38 years. You do not have to do this, I said. I know, she said. That's why I'm doing it. Miller's unmarked vehicle would be parked 2 spaces down from the diner entrance. A second deputy would be inside at the counter eating a newspaper. Martha would go in alone, order coffee, and wait for Raymond and Chloe to arrive. She would let them talk. If they said what Miller believed they would say, the device would capture every word. I watched her car back out of the driveway from the front porch, the same porch where this had all begun, the same 2 oak trees in the front yard, the same mockingbird, or one very much like it, moving through its repertoire in the left tree. Dennis appeared at my elbow at some point during the waiting, the way Dennis had been appearing at my elbow all week, without announcement, without asking if he was wanted. Simply present in the reliable way that some people are present when it matters. He handed me a cup of coffee. She's going to be fine, he said. I know, I said. You don't know, he said. You hope. There's a difference. I looked at him. He was right, which was irritating, which meant he was being Dennis, which was oddly comforting. We stood on the porch and drank our coffee and waited. 47 minutes later, Miller called. His voice had the particular quality it had carried after the camera footage confirmation, after the GPS results, after each piece of the case that had moved from possible to certain. Controlled and precise with something underneath it that was not quite satisfaction, but was close to it. She did it, he said. We have everything we need. Martha is safe and she is on her way home. I set my coffee cup down on the porch railing, the same railing where I had set down the contents of the red-wrapped box 8 days ago, and I pressed both hands flat against the wood and stood there for a moment with my eyes closed. 38 years, and I had still been underestimating her. Dennis put a hand on my back. Told you, he said. Before I reveal the chilling conversation captured on the secret wire recording where Raymond and Chloe's true faces are completely exposed, please leave a comment saying, "Still here," or the number 14 below, so I know you're still watching. Also, please note The next part of the story contains some fictional elements, which may not be entirely real. If you do not wish to hear these harsh details, you may stop the video right here. There are moments in life when you hear something so cold, so deliberate, so completely stripped of anything resembling conscience, that the air in the room seems to change temperature around you. I have experienced a handful of those moments in 60 years. The call about Caroline. The morning the doctors explained what the stroke had done to my hand. The afternoon I read the note inside the red-wrapped box. This was another one. Miller played the recording that afternoon in the conference room. The same table, the same chairs, the same pale Texas light coming through the window. Martha sat beside me. She had changed her clothes since the morning and drunk 2 cups of tea and had the composed, slightly distant expression of someone who had done something difficult and was still in the process of returning to herself. Thomas Garner sat at the end of the table with his notepad. Dennis was in his usual chair in the corner, coffee in hand, newspaper folded on his knee and entirely unread. Miller placed a small digital player on the table. He looked at me before pressing play. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "some of what you're about to hear may be difficult. I want you to know that you can ask me to stop at any point." "Play it," I said. The recording began with ambient sound, the particular acoustic texture of a busy diner on a weekday morning. Dishes, low conversation, the hiss of a coffee machine. Then Martha's voice asking for a refill. Then the sound of a door, footsteps, the scrape of chairs. Raymond's voice, asking how she was doing, saying she looked tired. Then Chloe's voice. I had heard Chloe speak hundreds of times across my kitchen table, at holiday dinners, in the driveway on Sunday afternoons. I knew the measured, careful quality of her normal speech, every sentence constructed, every word chosen. What came through the recording was something different, looser, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with confidence. The particular ease of someone who believed they were among allies. "You know what the funny thing is," Chloe said, and I heard her set something down on the table, a coffee cup probably. "The whole time I kept thinking someone was going to say something. A teller, a manager, somebody. But they processed it. Every single time." Martha's recorded voice, careful and neutral. "You weren't nervous." "Nervous?" Chloe laughed. It was a light sound, social. The laugh of someone recounting a minor inconvenience that had turned out fine. "I had done my research. I knew exactly what they checked. ID account number, last 4 of social. I had all of it." A pause. "And the bandaging helped. Nobody wants to stare at someone who looks like they just had dental surgery. They look at the paperwork instead." I felt Martha's hand find mine under the table. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on the player. "The old man had just had a stroke," Chloe continued. Her voice had shifted slightly, not colder, but more direct. The social warmth dropping away to reveal the calculation underneath. "You think he even remembers what he signed and didn't sign? His handshakes. His memory is going to be all over the place for months. That's just what happens." Another pause. "By the time anyone starts asking real questions, we're in a completely different position." Thomas Garner's pen had stopped moving. Dennis in the corner had set his coffee cup down very carefully on the floor beside his chair, as if he did not trust himself to hold it steadily. Miller let the recording continue. Martha's voice asked about the surgery, the procedure Chloe had undergone at a clinic in Oklahoma City 3 weeks earlier, under a name that was not her own, paid for in cash, drawn from one of the accounts she had accessed, using my forged signature. Chloe described it with the enthusiasm of someone who had wanted something for a long time and had finally obtained it. The details were specific and unhurried. She was proud. She wanted Martha to know how well it had gone. Then Martha's recorded voice shifted, became slightly hesitant. Said she wasn't sure she could do what Raymond was asking, that it felt like a lot, that she wasn't sure about telling investigators that Arthur had been confused. The temperature in the recording changed. Raymond's voice came in, lower than it had been, faster. "Mom!" The word landed flat. "We have talked about this. This is not optional." Martha's voice. "Raymond, I'm just saying." "No." His voice rose. "You don't get to just say anything right now. Do you have any idea what happens if this falls apart? Do you understand what these people do when you owe them what I owe them? Raymond, I need you to tell them Dad was confused." His voice was shaking now, not with grief, not with remorse, with the specific tremor of a person who was genuinely frightened and had stopped caring about anything except their own survival. "I need you to say he talked about opening accounts, about moving money around, because that is the only way this works. The only way. And if you won't do that—" He stopped, drew a breath. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, which was somehow worse than when it had been raised. "If you won't do that, Mom, then I don't know what happens to any of us, including you." The recording continued for another 4 minutes. Then it ended. The conference room held the silence the way a room holds smoke. You could feel it against your skin, taste it at the back of your throat. My right hand was shaking, not from the stroke. I pressed it flat against the table and breathed in through my nose the way Dr. Thorne had taught me during my recovery, slow, deliberate, the discipline of a man who had spent 60 years keeping himself functional under difficult circumstances and was not going to stop now. "He threatened her," I said. My voice came out even. "He sat across from his mother in a diner where we ate breakfast for 20 years, and he threatened her." Miller nodded. He did not offer commentary. "The surgery," I said. "Oklahoma City, under a different name." "We have already contacted the clinic," Miller said. "They are cooperating fully. The records confirm the date, the cash payment, and the name used. Combined with the banking footage and Gloria Reyes's testimony, it establishes a complete chain from the forged transactions to Chloe directly." I looked at Martha. She was looking at the digital player on the table, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression the careful stillness of someone who had done something hard and had not yet decided how she felt about having done it. "Martha," I said. She looked at me. "You walked in there alone," I said, "with our son and his wife, knowing what they had done. And you sat across from them and you did not flinch." Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He's still my son," she said quietly. "That doesn't change what he did. But it doesn't change what he is to me either." She lowered her eyes back to mine. "I just needed him to say it himself, so that nobody could ever tell me I imagined it." Miller closed the player. "Mr. Calloway," he said, and his voice carried something I had not heard in it before, a finality clean and certain, the sound of a door closing on the right side. "I think we have everything we need. I have never been this kind of man who wanted attention. 35 years of counting textbooks in a school warehouse will cure you of that particular ambition if you had it to begin with. The best days of my working life were the days when everything moved correctly, every number balanced, and nobody needed to call the warehouse about anything because there was nothing to call about. Invisible competence. That was what I had always aimed for. What happened on the morning of the 10th day was the opposite of invisible. Miller called at 7:45 to tell me the arrests had been made. Raymond and Chloe had been taken into custody at their apartment at 6:15 that morning, which meant the arrest warrants issued by a county magistrate the previous afternoon, on the basis of the complete evidence package Miller's office had assembled, had been executed before either of them had finished their first cup of coffee. They were cooperative, Miller said, which I understood to mean they had not done anything that would make things worse for themselves in the short term, whatever their longer-term intentions were. "Thank you, Sheriff," I said, "for everything." There was a brief pause on the line. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "in 18 years, this is one of the more thorough cases I have seen built in 10 days. That is not my doing. That is documentation. Yours and Dennis's and the people who kept records when records needed keeping." Another pause. "Your father was right about that." I had told Miller somewhere in the middle of one of our long conference room afternoons about my father's belief that a man's word and a man's records were the same thing. I had not expected him to remember it. "He was right about most things," I said. I went out to the porch after the call. Martha was already there, sitting in the blue chair, with a cup of tea looking out at the oak trees in the early morning light, the way she sometimes sat on Sunday mornings, when she did not want to talk yet, and neither did I. I sat down in the chair beside her, and we looked at the trees together. The mockingbird was in the left oak again. "It's done," I said. She nodded. She wrapped both hands around her teacup and looked at the yard. "How do you feel?" I thought about that honestly, the way you think about a question, when the person asking it deserves an honest answer. "Tired," I said, "and something else I don't have a word for yet." She looked at me sideways. "I think the word is relieved. You just haven't let yourself use it yet." She was probably right. Martha usually was about the things that mattered. By mid-morning, the local news had the story. Not our names, the station was careful about that, reporting only that 2 individuals had been arrested in connection with an alleged financial fraud and forgery scheme targeting an elderly Millhaven resident. But Millhaven was not a large town, and the distance between an arrest on the east side and a story on every phone on the west side was roughly 45 minutes. By 11 o'clock, Dennis was at the door with a pound cake his neighbor had baked and sent over because apparently the news had reached his street, and his neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Farley, who had lived next door to Dennis for 22 years and considered feeding people the appropriate response to most situations, had decided that Arthur Calloway needed a pound cake. I accepted it gratefully. By noon, my phone had rung 7 times. Former colleagues from the school district. A man I had coached Little League with 20 years ago, who had heard something at the hardware store. The pastor from the church we had attended sporadically for 15 years, who left a voicemail that was warm and genuine and did not ask any questions, which I appreciated more than I could express. Each call required me to say in one form or another that we were all right, that things were being handled, that we were grateful for the concern. We were all right. Things were being handled. We were grateful. All of it was true. All of it was also incomplete the way summaries of difficult things are always incomplete. What I could not explain in a 5-minute phone call. What I am not sure I can fully explain now was what it felt like to have spent 10 days watching the thing that was meant to destroy me be taken apart piece by documentation and careful work, and the stubborn refusal of people like Dennis and Gloria Reyes and Dr. Thorne and my wife to let a lie stand unchallenged. That afternoon, Martha and I drove out to the east side to pick up Lily from her aunt's house. We had agreed with her Aunt Martha's younger sister Carol, who had been keeping Lily for the week, with the particular competent kindness of someone who did not ask too many questions and simply did what was needed, that we would not say more than necessary until things were settled enough to explain properly. Lily came running out of the front door, the way she always came running, at a speed that suggested she was perpetually surprised to find that the floor was in fact still there. She hit me at approximately midsection level, grabbed my jacket, and said into my ribs in the slightly muffled voice of someone whose face was pressed against fabric that she had made me a card at school and it had a bear on it. "A bear," I said. "Grandpa Bear," she said. Obviously. I held on to her for a moment longer than I usually would. She allowed it with the grace of a child who understood. On some level, she could not yet articulate that the holding was necessary. On the drive home, she sat in the back seat with Martha's hand reached back between the seats, holding hers, looking out the window at the flat Texas evening coming in across the fields. "Grandpa Bear," she said after a while. "Yes, sweetheart." "Is the bad stuff over?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was turned toward the window, watching the fields go by, entirely trusting that whatever I said next would be the truth, because I had never told her anything else. Martha looked at me. I looked at the road. Then I looked at Lily again. "Almost, sweetheart," I said. "Almost." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to watching the fields. Martha squeezed my hand across the center console. The Texas evening continued coming in wide and unhurried, the way Texas evenings do, as if the sky had all the time in the world and intended to use it. The courthouse in Millhaven County was built in 1931 during the kind of civic optimism that produced buildings meant to outlast the people who commissioned them. The floors were dark oak, worn smooth in the center of each corridor, where 70 years of foot traffic had polished them to a near-mirror finish. The benches in Courtroom 4 were the original wood, hard, unpadded, the kind that reminded you, after the first hour, that justice was not designed with physical comfort in mind. The ceiling was high and coffered, and the overhead lights hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of annoyance, which meant you were always faintly aware of them without being able to say exactly why. I had walked past that courthouse perhaps 1,000 times in my life. Parked in front of it. Mailed things at the post office 2 doors down. It had always been simply a building, solid, unremarkable part of the permanent furniture of the town I had lived in for 60 years. Walking into it as the person whose name was at the center of the case being heard inside was a different experience entirely. The trial began. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the morning, I had sat on my porch steps and called 911. Martha sat beside me in the gallery. Dennis sat on my other side in his good jacket, which I had never seen him wear before, and which still had the dry cleaning tag tucked inside the collar, a detail he would have been deeply irritated to know I had noticed. Thomas Garner sat in the row behind us with 2 associates from his office. Raymond and Chloe sat at the defense table. They had separate attorneys, a development that had occurred, Miller told me, within 48 hours of their arraignment, when it became apparent that their interests were no longer aligned, and that each of them would be better served by counsel focused exclusively on their individual situation. Raymond's attorney was a man in his 50s with a careful suit and the expression of someone managing difficult expectations. Chloe's attorney was younger, sharper looking, and spent the first morning of trial making notes on a yellow legal pad with the focused efficiency of someone who had already identified her best angle. Judge Harold Simmons was 64 years old, heavy-set, with close-cropped white hair and the patient, slightly weary manner of a man who had presided over Millhaven County proceedings for 19 years and had seen most categories of human behavior at least twice. He ran his courtroom with the particular economy of a judge who respected everyone's time and expected the same courtesy in return. When he spoke, people listened, not because his voice was loud, but because it had the quality of a voice that was not accustomed to repeating itself. The prosecution began with the documentary evidence. The stamped documents bearing the Millhaven County School District seal placed beside Dennis's binder, containing the original surrender receipt, which the prosecutor held up for the jury with the straightforward confidence of someone who knew exactly what it meant. Then the footage. The courtroom monitor's two large screens mounted on either side of the bench displayed the dashboard camera recording from my Subaru. The jury watched Chloe step out of the passenger side in front of Millhaven First National, her face wrapped in white medical bandaging. Her movements deliberate and unhurried. The timestamp burned in the upper right corner of the frame. Gloria Reyes took the stand after the footage had been played twice. She was composed. She described the transactions clearly and specifically, dates, amounts, the identification presented, the signatures obtained. When the prosecutor asked her to describe the person who had conducted those transactions, she did so in the careful language of someone who had prepared her words and intended to deliver them accurately. Then the prosecutor asked one additional question. Ms. Reyes, you testified that you have served Mr. Arthur Calloway personally on multiple occasions at your branch. In your observation, is there anything about the physical signatures on those transaction documents that is inconsistent with Mr. Calloway's typical presentation when signing? Gloria looked at the jury. The signatures on those documents are completely steady. No variation, no tremor. Mr. Calloway's hands have always shaken slightly when he signed at my window. I noticed it the very first time I helped him, and I noticed it every time after that. She paused. The person who signed those documents did not have shaking hands. Mr. Calloway does. Dr. Thorne followed. She presented the MRI results with the efficiency of someone who had testified as an expert witness before and understood the difference between what a jury needed to know and what would lose them. She explained the localized motor tremor in precise but accessible terms. She displayed the signature comparison, the controlled even pen pressure of the forged signatures against the slight irregularity characteristic of Arthur's genuine hand. She answered the defense attorney's questions without defensiveness and without elaboration, which is the particular competence of a witness who knows exactly where the truth is and does not need to travel far from it. Then the prosecutor called Lily. Judge Simmons had conducted the competency examination in chambers the previous afternoon, a standard requirement for child witnesses under Texas rules of evidence designed to establish that the child understood the difference between truth and a lie, and the obligation to tell the truth in court. Lily had apparently satisfied him on both counts, because she walked into the courtroom the following morning with the particular composure of a child who had been told exactly what was going to happen and had decided she was ready for it. She was 8 years old. She was wearing a blue dress Martha had pressed the night before. She sat in the witness chair and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the prosecutor. I looked at Raymond. He was looking at the table in front of him. His attorney had one hand on his forearm, whether in support or restraint, I could not tell. The prosecutor walked Lily through her account, the same way the forensic interviewer at the Child Advocacy Center had unhurried specific one clear question at a time. Lily answered each one in the direct, uncomplicated way of a child who was telling the truth and knew it and was not performing anything beyond that simple fact. She described the Saturday afternoon, Uncle Raymond coming inside while Grandpa Bear was in the backyard, the hallway, the bedroom, the 5 minutes, the object in the pocket, the instruction not to tell because it was a surprise. Raymond did not look up. When Lily finished her account, the prosecutor paused for a moment. Then he asked his final question. Lily, can you tell us why did you decide to tell your teacher what you saw? Lily looked at him. She thought about it for a moment, with the seriousness of a child who was treating the question with the weight it deserved. Because, she said, Ms. Webb always says that if something feels wrong in your stomach, you should say so. And it felt wrong. And Grandpa Bear never did anything wrong. She paused. And I didn't want him to be in trouble for something he didn't do. The courtroom was quiet. Not the performed silence of people being careful, The natural silence that falls when something true has been said simply by someone with no reason to say anything other than the truth, and the room has recognized it. Raymond's attorney cleared his throat. Judge Simmons looked at the jury over the top of his glasses. I looked at my hands flat on my knees, the right one trembling slightly, the left one still, and I thought about 35 years of documentation, of careful records of a father's belief that if you did things right, eventually the record would speak for itself. The record was speaking. I had wondered during the 3 weeks between the arrests and the trial how Raymond and Chloe would handle the moment when there was nowhere left to hide. I had imagined several versions. Defiance, the particular defiance of people who had committed themselves too far to reverse course, and had decided that doubling down was the only remaining option. Remorse, though I had difficulty making, that one feel convincing even in my imagination. Or silence, the silence of people who had been advised by counsel to say as little as possible and had the discipline to follow that advice. What I had not imagined was what actually happened on the 4th morning. Chloe's attorney stood up before the prosecution, had completed its opening remarks for the day, and informed Judge Simmons that his client wished to address the court. There was a brief recess. When we reconvened, the prosecutor announced that an agreement had been reached, a plea arrangement under which Chloe would provide truthful testimony regarding the planning and execution of the scheme in exchange for a reduced charge and sentencing recommendation. She had apparently been negotiating this privately for the previous 48 hours, which explained the focused yellow legal pad efficiency I had noticed in her attorney since the first morning of trial. Raymond did not know. I watched his face when his attorney leaned over and told him. The color left it not quickly the way Martha's face had gone pale on the porch, but slowly, like light leaving a room when the sun moves behind a cloud. His jaw tightened. He said something to his attorney in a low voice. His attorney said something back. Raymond sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Chloe took the stand. She was composed in the way that people are composed when they have made a decision and are committed to it, not comfortable but settled. She answered the prosecutor's questions in the same measured, precise voice she used for everything, and what she described was a plan that had been more than 14 months in the making. The key duplication, the stamp theft, the forged documents she named Kevin Harlow, a former paralegal acquaintance of Raymond's, as the person who had prepared the legal forgeries, a name that generated immediate note-taking among the attorneys, and that Miller, sitting in the gallery 2 rows behind me, wrote down with particular attention. The bank transactions, Oklahoma City, the anonymous call. She described Raymond's role in each element with the specificity of someone who had been present for all of it, which she had been. Raymond's attorney objected several times. Judge Simmons sustained some, overruled others, and continued with the patient economy that characterized everything he did in that courtroom. Then the prosecutor asked Chloe one final question. Ms. Calloway, whose idea was it to use the forged passbook and the stamp to implicate Mr. Arthur Calloway in financial misconduct? Chloe looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. Raymond's, she said. He came to me with the outline of it. I helped with the details. Raymond made a sound. Not a word. Something before words, the particular sound a person makes when something they were holding in place with everything they had finally gives way. He turned to look at Chloe for the first time since she had taken the stand. You told me this was going to work, he said. His voice was raw, stripped of every layer of performance. You said nobody would figure it out in time. You said, Mr. Calloway? Judge Simmons's voice cut across the room cleanly. You will remain silent, or I will have you removed. Raymond's attorney put a hand on his arm. Raymond sat back. He was breathing hard. His hands on the table in front of him were shaking, not from any medical condition, but from the specific physical manifestation of a plan collapsing. I looked at those shaking hands and thought briefly about my own. The jury was in deliberation for 4 hours and 17 minutes. I spent those hours in the courthouse corridor with Martha and Dennis and Thomas Garner on the same hard benches the building had presumably provided for this purpose since 1931. Dennis produced sandwiches from somewhere, the way Dennis had been producing food at appropriate intervals throughout the entire preceding weeks, and we ate them without much conversation, because there was not much left to say that had not already been said in a courtroom or a conference room or on a porch in the early morning. When the bailiff appeared in the corridor doorway and told us the jury was ready, Martha took my hand. We walked back in together. Judge Simmons read the verdicts in the same level voice he had used for everything, as if the words carried enough weight on their own, without any additional emphasis from the person delivering them, which was true. Raymond Allen Calloway, guilty on 4 counts of felony forgery, guilty on 2 counts of identity fraud, guilty on 1 count of criminal conspiracy, guilty on 1 count of witness tampering. The sentencing recommendation from the jury included a prison term of between 8 and 12 years, subject to the judge's final determination at the formal sentencing hearing, scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Chloe received her reduced sentence under the plea agreement, 36 months of supervised probation, mandatory restitution to the affected accounts, and a permanent felony record that would follow her regardless of where she went or what name she used. Her attorney accepted the terms without expression. Chloe sat very still and looked at the table. Kevin Harlow, the name Chloe had provided, was noted by the court for separate investigation. When the bailiff moved to escort Raymond from the courtroom, Raymond stood slowly. He straightened his jacket with both hands, the automatic habitual gesture of a man adjusting his appearance, performed without apparent awareness that it was the wrong thing to focus on in that moment. He turned. I thought he was going to look at me. I had been preparing for that in the way you prepare for things you cannot control, not with a plan exactly, but with a posture, a readiness. He did not look at me. He looked at Martha. Martha, who had sat at his side for 34 years, who had driven him to school and made his lunches and attended his games and absorbed more of his failures than she had ever told me about, who had walked into a diner alone with a recording device against her chest because she had decided that protecting the truth mattered more than protecting her own heart. Martha held his gaze for a moment. Her face was not hard. It was not angry. It was the face of a woman who had loved someone completely and had discovered that love was not sufficient protection against who that person had chosen to become. Raymond looked away first. The bailiff placed a hand on his elbow and guided him toward the side door. Raymond walked without resisting. He did not look back. The door closed. Dennis let out a long, slow breath beside me, the breath of a man who had been holding something in for 3.5 weeks and was finally setting it down. Well, he said, in the particular Dennis Holt tone that managed to contain everything without specifying anything. Yes, I said. Martha was still looking at the door through which Raymond had gone. Then she turned to me, and whatever she had been holding in her face released all at once, not dramatically, not with collapse, but with the particular quiet unwinding of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could put it down. I put my arms around her. Thomas Garner gathered his papers. Dennis folded his hands. The overhead lights hummed at their frequency just below annoyance. Outside the high coffered windows of Courtroom 4 Millhaven went about its afternoon. Somewhere in this town I thought a little girl was in school coloring something with a bear on it, entirely unaware that the thing that had been threatening to take her grandfather away from her had just been set down in this room by 12 people she would never meet, on the basis of records that two careful men had kept for 35 years. I held Martha and I thought about that. It was enough. People ask me if I am angry. I tell them the truth I was, for longer than I want to admit. But anger is a thing that requires fuel, and at some point I simply stopped feeding it. Not because I had forgiven everything, because I had better uses for the time. Raymond received 9 years at the formal sentencing. I did not attend. Martha did not attend. Thomas Garner sent an associate and called me afterward. I thanked him, made coffee, and sat on the porch, watching the first suggestion of autumn move through the oak trees. Gloria Reyes sent a letter. 2 handwritten paragraphs, plain white paper. She had updated the bank's verification protocols for large cash withdrawals, additional identity confirmation for customers with documented medical conditions. I wrote back the same day. The next time I came into the branch, she was still at her window. She is. Dr. Thorne called in October. The tremor was improving, slow, incremental, real. Before she hung up, she said, "That was the first time I drove myself down at 6:45 in the morning without being asked." I told her I was grateful. She told me to keep doing the exercises. Dennis came by with apples from a farm stand on Route 12. We sat on the porch the way we had sat on porches for 35 years, 2 men with nothing urgent to accomplish, and enough shared history that the silence between us was full rather than empty. Lily came on the weekends. On a Saturday afternoon in October, she called down from the Redding tree, her name for the left oak with a book about horses in her lap. "Is this our house?" I thought about the deed, about the new will in Thomas Garner's safe with her name in it. "Yes," I said. "This is our house." She turned a page. "Good." My right hand rested on the arm of the porch chair. It trembled slightly in the afternoon light. I let it. If there is one thing this family story taught me, it is this: the records you keep are not just paper. They are proof that you existed honestly in a world that does not always reward honesty. I spent 60 years doing things right, and when someone tried to use that life against me, the records fought back. Every receipt kept in a fireproof box by a friend who believed in me when my own son did not. I believe God puts the right people in your path at the right moment. Dennis, Gloria, Dr. Thorne, Martha. Even Lily, 8 years old and telling the truth because it felt wrong in her stomach not to. I did not deserve all of that grace, but I received it. My personal opinion. A man's character is not what he says about himself. It is what the paperwork says when no one is watching. If you take anything from this grandpa story, let it be this: do not wait until a crisis to document your life. Do not assume the people you love are who you think they are. And do not, as I did for too many years, confuse keeping the peace with accepting mistreatment. That is a family story too many of us are living without naming it. If this grandpa story moved you, if something here reminded you of your own family story, your own quiet battles, your own reasons to keep going, please share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment. It costs nothing and means more than you know. And if you haven't already subscribed, there are more stories waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain some dramatized elements crafted for reflection and understanding. If that is not what you are looking for today, no harm done. Choose what serves you. We will be here when you are ready.